The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education, connect to a world of learning.
When the first movies were made 100 years ago, a common subject was the American Indian. They were practically always shown as a primitive, savage, and warlike people. They were the bad guys who screamed a lot, terrorized towns, and attacked innocent settlers. Through the years, the same images of rampaging renegades were repeated over and over. Indians were seen as objects of scorn and contempt.
I told you not to shoot. Well, they're savages, aren't they?
An Indian will swear to anything if he thinks he can get something out of it.
The only Indian that don't lie is a dead one.
Dirty, mean, ignorant, slinking, red-skinned skunks.
Sneaking Indian swine.
Long arrow,
They seldom spoke, and when they did, it was always in short, simple sentences.
White man speak truth.
It's long way to town.
Their traditions, customs, and ceremonies were seldom shown accurately and were often comical. That's how Indians were shown in movies. But who were they really? What were they like? What happened to them? 500 years ago, North America was home to millions of native peoples. They had lived here for thousands of years and inhabited every part of the continent. These were not one-dimensional movie stereotypes. They were real people with their own unique personalities. They had families and shared the same hopes and dreams with people of today. There were hundreds of tribes. Each spoke a different language and lived in a different way, adapting to the unique environments in which they thrived, including the forests along the northwest coast, the arid deserts of the southwest, the vast grasslands of the Great Plains, and the woodlands of the east. The people lived close to nature, respecting the world around them. They had lived this way for thousands of years, and there was little reason for them to think that their lives would ever change. Then, in 1492, an Italian explorer by the name of Christopher Columbus set foot in the New World. He thought he had discovered a new route to India, and mistakenly referred to the native peoples he encountered as Indians. The name has stuck ever since, although they're often called Native Americans today. While Columbus is celebrated as a great explorer, he came to the New World to find gold and other wealth. He forced the Indians to work as slaves, and when they did not cooperate, they were often tortured and killed. Columbus found little wealth in the New World, but this didn't stop others from coming after him. One Spanish explorer, Hernando de Soto, landed in Florida in 1539 and led his army through the forests of the southeast in search of gold. De Soto and his men were ruthless in their pursuit of treasure. They used murder, torture, and terror to get what they wanted. Some Indians had their hands and feet amputated. Others were hung. Some were burned alive. The Spanish brought hundreds of large war dogs, which were used to strike fear in the people.
They were very much impressed and fearful of our large war dogs, of which we had many. To these was fed the son of the chief when he refused our demands for supplies and bearers. In this way, we secured the cooperation of the village. Hernando de Soto.
Tens of thousands of Indians died without ever seeing a Spaniard. They were the victims of smallpox and other diseases carried to the New World by the Spanish. The diseases spread from village to village. Entire populations were wiped out. Once great tribes were reduced to ruin. In the Southwest, a similar story is told. The Spanish explorer Coronado led an army into Pueblo land in search of treasure, brutalizing the Indians along the way. Finding none of the riches he had expected, Coronado left the Southwest 2 years later. It wasn't long until the Spanish were back, this time not in search of gold, but souls. They established outposts called missions throughout the Southwest, from which they could spread the word of the Bible and convert the Indians to Christianity. There were dozens of missions, and each was built about a day's ride apart. Some missionaries treated the Indians with kindness and provided jobs, food and shelter for those willing to obey mission rules. But the missionaries were strict, and when the Indians refused to do what the Spanish told them, they were treated brutally. The Spanish had little desire to remain in the New World. With the English, it was different. They wanted to stay here. The first successful permanent English colony was established in Jamestown in what is now the state of Virginia in 1607. In just a few years, the entire eastern seaboard was dotted with English colonies. Some of the new colonists were Pilgrims, a strict religious group escaping persecution at home. In 1620, they established a colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. At first, many tribes embraced the new settlers as friends and even helped them through difficult times. This country's first Thanksgiving honored Native Americans whose generosity helped keep settlers from starving and allowed them to prosper. But as the number of settlers increased, so did conflicts. Hungry for land, the new Americans felt the Indians had to be moved aside in the name of progress. Treaties were made in which the Indians gave up some of their land voluntarily, but no matter how much land was given away, it never seemed to be enough, and eventually the Indians had no choice but to resist and fight back. The Pequot War in 1636 was the first war fought with Indians in New England. As shown in this engraving, colonists set fire to a large Pequot village. An eyewitness gave this account.
Many Indians were burned in their village, both men, women, and children. It is reported that there were about 400 souls in the village, and not above 5 escaped out of our hands. Captain John Underhill.
The Pequot War was just the first of many that flared up throughout the eastern woodlands. In the south, colonists came up against tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek and defeated them on the battlefield. Greatly outnumbered and realizing further resistance was futile, the Indians adopted white ways and went on to become successful business people and property owners. Some wore the finest clothing and lived on grand plantations, enjoying the fruits of their labor. But some whites, envious of the Indians' success and land, pressured the government to do something about it. The United States Congress responded by passing the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law required Indians to give up their land and move to less valuable parcels in the West.
The white settlers wanted our land. They didn't want Indians in their part of the country. They wanted Indians removed far beyond the view of the white man. So that's what it did, and it took our land.
Under the Indian Removal Act, tribes in the East would be relocated to land in Oklahoma. Indians would have to give up their homes and businesses, all that they ever had known. Supporters of the act argued that it would actually benefit Indians.
It was suggested that the Indian Removal Act would benefit the tribes by removing us far from white people who wanted our land. So the attitude was that, we'll move you where you won't be bothered anymore. But certainly our history said that we would, and we were.
The Cherokee wouldn't go willingly, so in 1838, U.S. soldiers were brought in to force the Indians from their land and burn their homes. They were then forced march, sometimes in snow, over 1,000 miles to land in Oklahoma. Along the way, 4,000 Cherokees died from disease, exposure, starvation, and murder.
All along the trail, the elderly, the sick, prodded to exhaustion. Many of them died from exposure, died from the experience, died from diseases of the camp, so that by the time that they reached Oklahoma, their numbers were considerably diminished.
A newspaper reporter at the time had this to say:
"Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that marked the trail of the Cherokees to their exile."
Some tribes refused to be relocated. The great Seminole leader Osceola led his people into the swamps of the Everglades. Here they hid for years, using hit-and-run tactics against the U.S. soldiers who came for them. The resistance ended when Osceola was captured and his followers surrendered. By forcing Indians west of the Mississippi River, the United States thought that the Indians would be out of its way once and for all. But America was growing rapidly, and it wasn't long before pioneers began moving west across Indian land, heading for California and Oregon. They were followed by miners who trespassed on sacred Indian land in violation of treaties in search of gold and silver. They were followed by the railroads, which cut through the heart of Indian country and interfered with the migration of the buffalo, the Plains Indians' main source of food. What's worse, the railroads hired professional hunters to kill buffalo to provide food for the railroad workers, reducing the number available to Indians. Buffalo were also killed for their hides. After the skins were stripped from the animals, the carcasses were left to rot. Realizing the devastating effect the loss of the buffalo would have on Indians, the government encouraged people to kill as many buffalo as possible.
The government actually provided free guns and free ammunition to buffalo hunters, and they also provided revenue to purchase the buffalo skins, so that the incentive was there for people to go out and do that. And you had people that would go out and kill hundreds and thousands of them as an economic opportunity for themselves. And then there was also the train and the railroad system was just being put through this part of the country. And so you had a lot of people that would just come as tourists, and they would bring their rifles, and they allowed them to just shoot the buffalo from the train as they went by, just the way that I guess you would shoot at tin cans today.
Buffalo hunting by train was a favorite pastime of wealthy sportsmen who would ride out west in luxurious railroad cars and shoot countless buffalo from the safety of the slow-moving trains. Once numbering 60 million, the buffalo population was reduced to 1,000. Their way of life threatened, Indians responded by attacking anyone who trespassed on their land. In response, the army built forts throughout the plains from which soldiers could protect immigrants, but instead of pacifying the Indians, the presence of the forts angered them even more. In an effort to keep the peace, the United States met with the Plains tribes in 1851 and again in 1868 at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, to sign treaties. The Indians agreed to stop hostilities and stay on areas of land set aside for them, called reservations, in exchange for food and supplies. One Indian remarked at the time,
"We received many gifts, beef, bacon, medals, uniforms, but I don't know what good will come of it. How can a piece of paper stop all the bloodshed?"
Unfortunately, he was right. The peace would not last, and there were numerous incidents in the years that followed. In the Southwest, Indians, including the Navajo and Apache, led numerous raids against settlers and soldiers. The Apache were especially troublesome. Wishing to put an end to Indian resistance in the Southwest once and for all, General James Carleton ordered soldiers to kill any Apache man they ran across.
All Apache men are to be killed whenever and wherever you can find them. If they surrender, remind them that they murdered innocent whites when they were trying to surrender. Tell them that you have no power to make peace, that you are there to kill them.
The Apache fled to rugged mountains in New Mexico and Arizona. The Navajo fled to a maze of inaccessible canyons and mesas in northern Arizona. In pursuit were soldiers led by Kit Carson, a famed scout. He and his men swept through the heart of Navajo country, capturing and killing as many Navajo as they could find. The Indians hid in caves high above the canyon floors, but it did them little good.
Another shot was heard, and another, and another. The firing gradually picked up, and soon it sounded like frying, with bullets hitting all over the cave. This went on nearly all afternoon. Then the firing ceased, but by that time nearly all the Navajos were killed. Men, women, children, young men and girls were all killed on the cliffs. Some just slid off the cliffs. At the bottom were piles of dead Navajo. Only a few survived. Blood could be seen from the top of the cliffs all the way down to the bottom.
Those who surrendered were forced marched 250 miles to a reservation in New Mexico, during which hundreds died or were killed.
Women and children traveled on foot. That's why we called it the Long Walk. It was inhuman, because the Navajos, if they got tired and wouldn't continue to walk further, were just shot down. They had to keep walking all the time, day after day, for about 18 or 19 days, through all kinds of hardships, like tiredness and having injuries. And when those things happened, the people would hear gunshots in the rear, but they couldn't do anything about it. They just felt sorry for the ones being shot.
Reservation land given to the Indians was some of the worst in the country. It was difficult to farm, and Indians were no longer able to hunt and fish in the old ways. Making matters worse was that some of the agents, who were supposed to provide food and supplies, stole them instead. Tribes on many reservations were starving, and the people were becoming angry.
The Indians were desperate. One of the problems that they had was that they could no longer hunt and farm in the old way because they were put onto reservations. They were also promised rations from the government as part of the treaties they had signed, but the rations didn't come. They had no way to provide food for themselves. They went to the Indian agent, and the Indian agent told them to eat grass.
The white agents were cheating us. They broke their treaties. They did not give us what they promised. Our people were starving, and we were very angry.
Thousands of desperate Sioux, angry by the way they were being treated, left their reservations and attacked settlers in what was to become known as the Minnesota Massacre.
They moved out from their reservation, mostly the young men and a few of the elders who were convinced to go along with them, and attacked a lot of the white communities, settlers in small towns in the region of northwest Iowa, southwestern Minnesota, and part of the eastern Dakotas. They moved from place to place and usually killed everybody they found.
Troops were called in, but by the time they could put the uprising down weeks later, more than 450 people had been killed. One of them was the man who had told the Indians to eat grass. He was found with his mouth stuffed with grass. Eventually, more than 300 Sioux warriors were tried and convicted, including Medicine Bottle, and Little Six, two of the leaders. 38 of them were hanged in Mankota, Minnesota, in this country's largest mass execution. More than 1,400 soldiers had to be called in to control the hostile townspeople. It was reported that the Indians sang songs up until the time they were hanged. Atrocities were committed by both sides. In 1864, U.S. soldiers attacked a peaceful Indian village near Sand Creek in Colorado, killing 150 Indians. Most of them were women and children, and their bodies were mutilated.
Sand Creek was a massacre because they attacked while it was still dark. They attacked villages of innocent men, women, and children, and they annihilated them and massacred them. And then we all know that they cut scalps, they cut private parts off Indian men, women, and children and put them on their saddles like trophies.
Even Kit Carson, who had fought the Indians in many battles, spoke out against the brutal attack.
"'Tain't natural for brave men to kill women and little children. No one but a coward or a dog would do it. All whites should be ashamed."
The Sand Creek Massacre angered Indians and stiffened their resolve to resist white encroachment, which was becoming more frequent as the United States expanded westward. In 1874, thousands of gold seekers poured onto Indian land in the Black Hills in South Dakota. The Black Hills were given to the Indians as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The Indians considered this area sacred, and the U.S. promised that no whites would ever be permitted to enter it. Yet the government did little to stop the gold seekers. To avoid possible hostilities, the government offered to buy the Black Hills. When the Indians refused to sell, the government ordered them onto their reservations. Many refused, so the army sent soldiers into the plains to force them back. Indians were hunted down, and if they refused to surrender, they were killed. One of the officers in charge of hunting down the Indians was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a fearless and brilliant officer who wanted to achieve a spectacular victory over the Indians. Blinded by his ambition for glory, Custer attacked an Indian village without first finding out how many braves he would be up against. What looked like a village of several hundred was actually a summer gathering of tribes numbering as many as 12,000. Custer's men were outnumbered 10-1 and were wiped out in less than an hour of frantic fighting in what has become known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
The Battle of the Little Bighorn may have seemed like a major victory for the Indians, but it wasn't. In fact, it was the beginning of the end.
When news of Custer's defeat reached the East, newspapers demanded that something be done.
This was a cold-blooded, barbarous massacre of men. When will the government realize that Indians are not men?
The battle wasn't a massacre at all. Custer and his men had attacked the Indians first.
The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not a massacre by the Indians. It was a battle where Custer came in armed with one of the most highly respected cavalry units in the United States Army. That was the 7th Cavalry, one of the finest fighting units, and General Custer, who was under commission from President Grant, knew that in order to correct the problem, the Indians had to be put on reservations. And so clearly, he sent his best to defeat the Indians, and President Grant's best, which is the 7th Cavalry, were wiped out in a fair fight because he underestimated the strength of the Indians. And it's one of the few times that the Indian tribes united against the United States.
One of the Indian leaders that day was Sitting Bull, a great Sioux chief.
All my warriors were brave and knew no fear. The soldiers who were killed were brave men too, but they had no chance to fight or run away. They were surrounded too closely by our many warriors. We did not go out of our own country to kill them. They came to kill us and got killed themselves.
As a result of Custer's defeat and the public outcry that followed it, the government sent even more soldiers to put down the Indians once and for all. Within 5 years, not a single Indian was living freely on the plains. Greatly outnumbered, beaten down, and starving, the Indians had no other choice but to resign themselves to reservation life. But the bloodshed didn't end there. In the 1880s, a new religious practice called the ghost dance swept the plains. By performing it, during which dancers entered a trance-like state, many Indians believed that all their dead relatives would come back to life, new herds of buffalo would appear, and that the whites would go away. Agents supervising the reservation didn't understand the ghost dance and became frightened, thinking that it was a war dance and that the Indians were about to attack. Troops were called in. Fearing an army attack, 350 Indians fled the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. They were eventually tracked down and surrounded by 500 soldiers near Wounded Knee Creek. The Indians, many of them old men, women, and children, agreed to surrender. But when the soldiers attempted to disarm them, someone fired a shot. The soldiers reacted by shooting into the crowd of Indians, killing as many as 240 of them, including women and children.
Once it started, it was too late to stop. You know, they went into a frenzy. They started shooting the women, children, and you know, they didn't stop until they had everyone that they could get.
The soldiers fired volley after volley into the helpless crowd. Some Indians tried to escape.
We tried to run, but they shot us like we were buffalo. I know there are some good white people, but the soldiers must be mean to shoot children and women. Indian soldiers would not do that to white children.
This tragic incident was to become known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Today, all that remains at Wounded Knee is this small cemetery honoring those who had fallen here more than a century ago. Hundreds of visitors, most of them non-Indian, visit here every day, paying their respects to the victims of this tragedy. But Wounded Knee today is not just a cemetery. It is also a symbol, marking the final chapter in the 400-year conflict with Native Americans in this country.